Hello and welcome to another video. This one is about misdirected or misguided education in the field of English language teaching. So this video, as most of my videos are, directed towards teachers of English. So let's spill the beans. In an attempt to sell a language and their ebooks and apps and courses, instead of having education as their priority, English as a foreign language has been reduced to a business, most schools being shareholder companies. Leading publishers of ESL material, posing as experts of the language and of education, are misguiding learners with oversimplified, misleading, and outdated explanations and methodologies, and don't really bother with improving and rectifying the materials by contemporaneous linguistics and other scientific studies, because it keeps learners, the customers, baffled about grammar rules and entranced with images and distracted by topic-based learning, not to mention keeping them in the classroom for months on end until they reach a higher level before addressing any other areas of English. Fooled into thinking English is easy, if not easier than most languages, learners don't take language learning more seriously past a level of independent competency. Had they been properly taught certain factors of how language works, it might have alleviated so many unnecessary impediments on the path to learning English. Instead, we hear the false argument that telling learners too much might discourage them, which is simply unfounded. No doubt, more astute learners who won't have fallen for false truths about how English works, for example, by rules of grammar, may well find themselves opting either to learn a different language altogether, or, as is more likely the case, since they need English for their livelihood, will rebel by not bothering to learn it as well as they could. And rightly so, given the circumstances. In fact, the methods and lack of linguistic integrity used to portray languages is rather slighted. Granted, English is not the only victim. Experienced teachers, such as myself, have a duty to speak out, not blaming learners with laziness or incompetency or ageism, etc., when it is the education system itself, the curricula, that is at fault. Failing to do so is incompetency, and it will backlash on them, not on the commoners. In my last video, I touched on how falsities about the English language tend to persist, like undesirable chewing gum sticking to the soles of our shoes on an otherwise beautiful day. To illustrate oversimplified and flawed terminology, here's a list. So-called regular and irregular verbs. When, 1, even the regular verbs have the affix d, ed, with 3 pronunciations, and 2 irregular verbs, which are basically a shift in sound, therefore an aspect of pronunciation. We'll get to that further on. So-called phrasal verbs, also we'll get more into detail about that. Largely also ignoring phrasal nouns and phrasal adjectives and the particles related to what follows and not connected to the verb itself. Then we have the so-called perfect tense. Although there may be plausible explanations for the perfect aspect, it is not a tense as such. Same goes for the continuous or progressive. It's an aspect, not a tense. The present simple is never temporal, so technically it cannot really be called anything but the non-past. So we've really got only 2 tenses, the past and the non-past, along with aspects. Last but not least, no, there is no future tense in English. Futurity is expressed by the continuous aspect or modality or a combination of modality and have, perfect aspect, and so on. Challenge teachers. I challenge you to surf for the genuine evidence and don't be content with my explanation as if it were the Bible of English, and especially not textbook explanations that normally teachers just parrot. To outline backward methodologies still used with teaching English, presenting the simple present first, while ignoring the function of be and have until much later, let alone disregarding the past tense until later as though it were too complex. Ignoring subjunctive moods until much, much later, even if these are so prominent in everyday human communication. If animals do have a language, we're probably the only animals that have the conditional and subjunctive. Restricting so-called conditionals to just 4 types, when there are virtually endless ways of expressing unreal hypothetical facts. And it's not always with if. Overemphasizing rules and grammar and giving very little weight on lexical aspects of the language and context. Limiting registered, formal, and informal, brushing away anything else under the rug as being slang. Being picky about spelling standards, while stunting natural, bluntly obvious changes in the language. Being inflexible or rigid with pronunciation differences, ignoring dialects. Unnecessary corrections by teachers and then by learners themselves is at the fore. Limiting spelling to so-called US and UK spellings. Again, oversimplifying explanations in fear of scaring learners from understanding other deeper yet meaningful aspects of communication. As I've pointed out, learners of English are taught trivial, misleading details and stereotypes and terms that distract them from coming to grips with how English actually works. One simple illustration is the regular and irregular verbs in a past context. So the rule, so-called rule, is the regular verbs in the past end in ed. Is ed a tense? It's simply an affix. And I've got somewhere in my ebook a whole list of verbs that end in E. And so, of course, you would in the past only add D. And this will be then contrasted with options of having so-called irregular verbs as synonyms. If you learn those in pairs, you might understand things a little bit better. So to illustrate actually what I've just mentioned, one experiment would be to build a list or chart like this one here, where you have a regular, so-called regular verb, axed, approached, departed, placed, provided, started, stopped. And then you can read them this way: axe, to cut, approach, come, depart, leave, and so on. Now, this is just something I'm working on in my ebook. My ebook expands. You're able to get my ebook for the same cost. You get more and more content at no extra cost. So these are the verbs I've come up with that might have some irregular equivalents. And I also have other charts. As you can see, I've organized them by sense verbs. This d sound: smelled, eyed, listened, nibbled, savored. And t sound: touched, looked, glanced. And we've got tasted. So you get a taste of my different approach. Another table here, we have the dynamic verbs ending in E with the different sounds, where only D is added. Basing your teaching on rules is the wrong way to go about it. Encourage different ways of looking at it. Ask, if you're a learner, ask your teacher, what is regular? What does that mean? What is irregularity? This is an aspect of beauty, the beauty of the language. How the sound shifts down, not always down, but often down. Seesaw, bear, ball, bore, where, wore, and so on. Choose, chose. Make it creative. For the spelling, it's like your adjective loose as a verb becomes lose. But also where the E ending forms a diphthong, initial vowel. Come, came, give, gave, make, made, where both are diphthongs here. Important to point those out. Pronunciation tends to be last on the list of items on your course book in a unit. So if this aspect of language is about sound changes rather than so-called exceptions to the ed affix, which is in itself only partially regular, why then aren't these aspects pointed out to learners in the books? Why aren't there audio files for irregular verbs? Very rarely. You find them in an appendix in alphabetical order, mostly useless. If you think I'm being radical, well, I think it's time we change things, and it'll go very slowly unless somebody speaks up. Trivializing leads to more questions. Why start regular while begin is irregular? But who has ever given a sound explanation for irregularity? What if it all had to do with the verb's charm, nothing to do with rules of conjugation? Consider these: dive, come, make, have, take. If they were regular, would they not still sound eloquent? I don't think so, somehow. But then you have those that don't change sounds. Hit or cut. We've got the syllabic eloquence, right? We've got the single syllable. Maybe if you hit somebody twice, it could be hitted. Why not? But the ed really has a significance, which means rendered, which is why a lot of this so-called ed past participles are not really participle. They're often just resultative adjectives. Rendered, resultative, ed. It's an affix. Just like the ing is an affix. Understand ing and its functions, and you have no need for the complication of terminology. Certain verbs end in consonant plus y, where the y is replaced by I before adding ed, which some will justify as being semi-regular. And see why it shouldn't be semi-irregular. To explain away irregularities, not to mention those with vowel plus y, like prayed and prayed, and don't forget holidayed, all ending in ed. But then what to make of words like pay, paid, say, and said, since the vowels are pronounced differently to some extent. Learning verbs really comes down to the music, eloquence, and charm in the language rather than through logic and rules and restrictions. Unless you only want to have one side of the brain working. Well, it's all right. And I don't mean that literally, of course. ed simply meant to render, where the verbs rendered into the past. Confused, not surprised. Well, those are adjectives, resultative adjectives. Blessed be those who are told that ed is used for the past participles and adjectives, because that's actually where the ed came from to begin with, since ed means to render. But it really comes down to the music, as I say, especially with irregular verbs. Okay, so why not devise, me thought, another way of looking at verbs, whereby the irregular ones can be connected with synonyms, regular verbs. Can it be done? Well, here we've got love, like, hate, and so on, but we've got enjoy. How are they different? Well, enjoy is always precedes ing form, whereas the love, like, hate can precede a prepositional phrase with to, a resultative. The to is purpose of something. So I tried to put it in a kind of an interesting columns by similarity. And this helps if you practice them either by columns or by rows. So I did say I would discuss further the myth about phrasals. So first of all, let's dispel the mist of phrasals. Such misleading terminology. It is an example of how we brush aside and explain away how English actually works. It relinquishes linguistics research, basically, that is also not really given justice, in preference for taking shortcuts fallacy to learning English. Now, there are 205 fallacies, so it's very easy to fall into a trap, including the terminology of each fallacy, right? I call it the shortcuts fallacy. There probably is a more technical term for that. But studying phrasals, of which there are maybe a dictionary of 15,000 or so, not to mention the transformations using adjectives and nouns on top of so-called regular verbs, and there are about 600 common verbs that we use. I'll show you how that works. So, and I've just got the link correct. You just click on there in the ebook and you get to this document, which is also as a PDF. And so students can learn to practice reading the columns separately in the past with the proper pronunciation of the ed. And that's 600 verbs. All here happen to be alphabetical, but at least they're alphabetical by sound. And you have the audio for the 4 pages. So each page has an audio, and they're not alphabetical, but they're in categorized by sound, starting with the most irregular and then going to the different phenomena of sound or no sound change. So there you can go through. It's also a PDF, and this is the way learners need to look at it, rather than alphabetically and without audio. Here you can see there are 2 changes, and in the 3rd column it's always recommended that students say have. So become, became, have become. Come, came, have come. Run, ran, have run. The have helps to strengthen the memory. Same goes for when there's only 2 columns. You can still read bring, brought, have brought, and so on. Okay, let's move on. Consider the following. Clog. Opposite of leak. Opposite, by the way, is another misleading thing for adjectives because there's not always just black and white. But just for the sake of it, clog and leak, similar problems, right? You don't want to clog and you don't want to leak. Many other verbs related to liquids are falsely labeled phrasals since 1. Up does not change the meaning of clog. And 2. Up is an adverb that simply refers to completion. Consider filler up, which means to completion, or speed, swiftness, and skill, as in hurry, hurry up. And I'll explain more about the particles from a phrasal further down. So stay with me. What would be rather more useful to know is whether the verb is a transitive or intransitive, especially since in this case clog may be either, and its meaning will change accordingly, or if the word refers to B, physicality or intellect, abstract. In the case of clog, it may be either. So looking at the Collins Dictionary and Thesaurus, this is the A to Z, by the way, you can see that you have the plain obstructed with thick or sticky matter or fluids. And we have the encumber, hinder, impede, which is more the intellectual, and to fasten a clog, another impediment. And then the intransitive, to adhere or stick in a mass. The slang, interestingly, is to foul in soccer football. Soccer, by the way, is a short word for association. The members of an association are the soccer. And it came from Britain, not US. Flawed analyses, phrasals are clogging the learners, to use the slang version creatively, though really it's more like fogging up their brain. And the stress from such fallacies is possibly clotting up their hearts and discouraging them from really taking English seriously from the heart. Even if one were to stubbornly favor the existence of such things as phrasals, insofar as clog isn't to be taken literally, especially since our brain is not a storing receptacle, but a receiver that recognizes patterns before we program habits and reactions and actions. Really, it is but the verb clog serving to represent an intellectual concept based on the physical dynamics of clogging. Its meaning hasn't changed, only the context. So clog up merely is idiomatic, which I estimate 97% of the English language to be. So rather than that, let's just, have learners try to understand these words. And I've categorized them into forms of liquid and reactions, chemical reactions in the brain, neurological. And we've got the actions and we've got the reactions. I think it's important to understand the underlying meaning behind these words. So you've got adjectives there, fluid, which of course is also a noun. I might then put a star and put there, and it can be a noun as well. And we've got that mixed with air. In the phrasal verb organizers from John Flower, he makes a general practical, he gives a list of the intrinsic meanings behind the particles. And this is what's really more important to get learners to understand. What does up mean? And with a lot of these, really it's a simplification. So if you search simplification in my ebook, you will get more explanations about simplification and what it means. So in is including, it's inclusive of, it's inward, inside, into. being involved in. So if teachers can't understand this concept and what I'm trying to say, then certainly learners won't get it. So I have another file here with adjectives ending in ed, and I don't think many books put this out. So these are interesting. Take a look. Learned, beloved, dogged, wretched, wicked, naked, rugged, jagged, crooked, and sacred. I mean, in Old English and Middle English, ed was pronounced everywhere. So now all you need to know are the ones that are pronounced and those which have been contracted. Nowadays, since the following can act as verbs in the past tense, they are usually pronounced ed, spelt ed and contracted to a t sound. Blessed, cursed, deuced, cussed, and aged, doomed, damned, condemned. So teachers can decide at what stage and what level they want to introduce this. And depending on the native language, the age, of course, those things, of course, I agree are aspects that one has to take into consideration. But I don't think we should be restricting learners, curious learners especially, with these sorts of things. So I'm really hoping that you will begin to consider getting my ebook. This is about my, I don't know, 13th or 14th video. There'll be more. Yeah, check out the videos I put out and hope this news spreads. Thanks, and have a nice day, have a nice evening.